Hello and welcome to the Band of One podcast. I am Riley Wilson, and this podcast is designed for absolutely anyone that wants to start, grow, or progress a solo or small group performing career. I've got over 50 years of live performance experience, and we use not only the lessons I've learned, but also tips from other hardworking pros in their neck of the woods. The idea here is to make this actionable, fun, and give you something you can actually use to make money right now. If you like what we do, subscribe and share the podcast and consider becoming a supporter. Let's get going. Today, I have the honor of talking with Sam Baker. Sam, welcome.
Hey, good morning, Riley. Thank you.
This is going to be a lot of fun. I didn't realize what an all-around entrepreneur you were until I saw your webpage. But boy, you've got you have a lot of irons in the fire. Would that be safe to say?
Yeah, there's a lot of irons in the fire. This is my retirement gig.
Wow. Well, I think that really resonates with a lot of people. As I've told several folks on the podcast for the last couple of years, there are a
Right,
lot of folks that decide at some point musically they want to reinvent themselves. Maybe they played
right,
in bands for years, or they'd always wanted to get out and perform, and they were, a bedroom musician or whatever. So let's begin at the beginning. What's your
sure.
story? Sort of where did you get going in music, and when did that begin for you in life?
Yeah, so it started, being shackled to a piano by my mother, and
That'll get you 5 to 10 in the state of Texas, right?
yeah, yeah. Actually, I grew up in New England. So
Really?
yeah,
Where?
I did. Boston. Yeah,
Interesting.
yeah, where we park our car and have a dad and all that stuff. So yeah, it was wicked good. Anyways, I took piano lessons for about 6 years, 6 to 7 years. And then one day I was kind of noodling around the piano in the music room at junior high school, and the music teacher said, "How would you like to play string bass?" Being a big dumb seventh grader at that point, I said, "Sure." So the school system, this was in the day when the school system actually sent a string bass to our house.
Wow.
And I had one at the school, obviously, and so I could practice, supposedly, and then play at the house. I didn't have to lug the thing back and forth, which was very good because the piano wouldn't fit in the car. We sort of got the bass in the car, and we did started with a couple of little folky kind of things and did that because you got to remember this is oh God, this is the mid 60s, right?
Okay.
Right after the great folk scare, right? So
Yeah.
it was, and of course I grew up in Boston, so the first song you have to learn is Charlie on the MTA.
Of course. I learned that song. This is funny you mentioned that. I learned that song in seventh grade. I was living
Yeah.
in Farmington, Michigan at the time. And I
Okay,
showed some
sure.
of my guitar students that song. And of course, it's almost like El Paso or maybe, American Pie. It's got like 19 verses, right?
Yeah. That's true. That's true. And then so then I picked up the guitar. Well, actually, I had a mandolin first. I had a friend of mine who had in the attic a bowl back mandolin. It looked like a gourd that they had
Yes.
sliced in half, right? So learned a little mandolin on that, and then I eventually got a guitar, and the guitar fit in the car much better than any of the other instruments. So that's where I went. Ended up much to the horror of my mother, who was a classical pianist, and
Wow.
that's sort of the way it all started. And then vocally, I was doing. We grew up Jewish, and so I was singing in temple, and I was actually performing solos during services and things like that. So it's been since junior high school that I've been mucking around in this stuff.
Well, let me ask you a question.
Sure.
How old were you when you started piano, Sam?
I was probably 7 or 8.
Okay. So
So
really, really
before,
young right there.
oh yeah, I was very young. I think I was done by the time I was about 13 or 14. But before that, I have this bare recollection of taking recorder lessons,
Hmm.
with a group recording, in some lady's home, right? And we all had instruments and we're squeaking our way through the day. And I mean, so I've had um, this musical underpinning for my whole life.
Wow. That's really cool. Now, you mentioned mom was a classical pianist. Anybody else in the house musical?
Well, yeah. Oh, there's so many great stories. My dad played piano. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with the Berklee School of
Oh,
Music.
of course. Yeah, absolutely. I've sent students to Berkeley over the years.
Okay, well, very good, very good. Larry Burke,
Hmm.
who started the Berklee School, was a classmate at MIT of my dad's.
Wow.
Now, he played saxophone. My dad played a little bit of, I don't want to say jazz piano, but more populist piano.
Hmm.
My mom actually wouldn't let him play very much in the house, you know. And so I mean, you have to remember this is in New England, and Sunday afternoons people would come over and they would visit, which meant you sit around the living room and you visit. And Larry Burke and his wife Lee would come. By the way, that's where Burke Lee comes from. Um,
Wow.
yeah, so they would come to the house and they would visit and they would chat and whatever, and they would leave and it would be very nice. And as soon as the front door closed, my mom would look at me and say, "You're not going to that school," because he was running a jazz
Wow.
school. He was running a jazz school, right?
Wow.
And she, "You're not going to that school." I said, "Okay, okay." I didn't know, right? Just a kid. And so yeah, so my mom was played classical music, and she played the Bach and the Beethoven and all that stuff, and she would practice. I mean, she was not a performer, but she grew up in the age where you learned to play piano and you learned some classical music and you could play few songs with competence, and that was that's we had her piano that she grew up with, which was a 1890 Steinway in the house for
Wow.
years, and that was it. So I grew up with that piano and that background in music, which by the way, I would suggest to anybody, even guitar players, if you're looking to understand music, take some piano lessons. There really is no better way to learn theory and music than sitting with a piano and learning the scales and learning that type of stuff. It gave me the underpinning to be able to do what I do today.
Well, I think both of us, because I know that you gig on guitar. I think both of us, I've been a teacher for, 30 some 40 years now. I think both of us would agree that piano is laid out a lot more logically, and you can see how things work much easier on a piano than you can on a guitar with note
Yeah.
duplicity and this note's found at this fret and that fret, that fret. It can be crazy, right?
I can tell you, I went one time to one of the local guitar shops, and they were giving guitar lessons in the back of the place, and I sat down with a guy, and I mean, I just bought a new guitar, and I knew a few chords because I could play a few folky songs. I wanted to learn something more, and so as a complete novice, I said, so show me middle C, because that's my frame of reference for the entire musical world. Show me middle C. And he looks at me, he says, "You took piano lessons, didn't you?" I said, "Yes." He said, "You will never be a guitar player." Obviously,
Wow.
obviously I didn't go back. I mean, he went on to say, "Well, there's four middle C's, and one here, one here, one here, one here, one here. Which one do you want?" It's like, okay. You know, 30 years later, I realized he was being a little bit obtuse, to be
Yeah.
nice, right? Um, and I still have, by the way, a linear view of scales and chords. You ask me what a C scale looks like, and if I close my eyes, I will see it on the piano. If an E minor scale, I will see it on the piano. I don't see that on the guitar the same way. And one of it's because, as you said, the piano is linear, right? And the guitar is a matrix. And
And a confusing matrix at that
well,
sometimes.
The more you play, and the more you start to see patterns, the confusion kind of dissipates a little bit.
Yes.
But in the early learning mode, it is very, very confusing, and that's why the piano is simpler in that sense to understand. After a number of years of playing and whatever, and I don't play piano, I plunk around a little bit. I have keyboards in the closet, right? But I plunk around a little bit just to try and figure things out. You start to see where the two instruments are the same and they vary, and then you start to understand sort of the I don't want to sound really eclectic, but you start to understand some of the theory underneath all of it and how it relates, right? And
Absolutely, absolutely.
yeah,
And at some point, and I actually deal with note duplicity in my book called Guitar Made Simpler
uh-huh,
because it is something that throw a lot of people off. I've had
sure,
dozens of folks that played piano over the years that come to the guitar, and I can explain to them, here's where they're different, where they're similar.
right,
And
right,
I think any amount of theory, particularly for those of you that don't read music, and this conversation is leaving you cold, stick with us because the amount of reading that I do in terms of my shows right now is actually fairly little. I'm almost always doing head arrangements, and I
right.
can hear stuff and play it pretty quickly, which I suspect is also true of you. Would that be correct?
First of all, one of my downfalls was I had a hard time reading music because of a vision thing. The spots on the page tended to blur, and it wasn't that they were out of focus, it's just my eyes didn't see it that way. I know there's some piano players that they just see it and they know where it all goes. I couldn't see that. So all of my musical ability to this day is done by memorization, whether it's pattern memorization or finger position memorization or things like that. I have to figure out the pattern, figure out where the fingers go, get that muscle memory going, and that's then I'm okay. Until then, I'm lost. I really am lost. Now, can I plunk out a scale on the piano? Yes, if I look at it note by note by note. But even the stuff that I was playing as a kid, this is another one of these great stories. I had stopped playing. I actually stopped playing music for quite a while I was in the corporate world, and just didn't have the time. I was traveling a lot, and I had a little piano. One time, I finally bought a piano. I said, I'm going to start to play piano again because I could do that. And so I went to a music store and bought the sheet music for the last song that I was able to play, which was Debussy's Le Petit Nègre. And if you don't know that, it's a not a simple piece of music.
You
And I
had to
opened
start at
up
the end, did you?
I said, well, I'll just pick up from where I left off, right? No, it doesn't work that way. I looked at the music. I said, holy baloney, did I ever play this stuff? Well, the answer is yes, I figured it out, but I had to do it all by memory. So eventually I would learn the piece, memorize the piece, and I wouldn't need the sheet music anymore. Faced with looking at the sheet music again, even with a very simple keyboard, I was toast. I hadn't practiced the reading ability, let alone playing the piece itself.
Sure, absolutely. Well, reading music is a skill like,
Yep.
somebody that's bilingual here in Texas, if you can speak a little Spanish at least, that really will help you out, particularly if you're in certain locations. So let's talk about you. You mentioned that you went from piano to string bass, then a
Right.
mandolin, and then the guitar slides in there somewhere. How did this go over with mom and or dad?
Well, so at that point, I think my mom basically gave up. The guitar I had, the mandolin I borrowed from a friend, and eventually they said, "Hey, we want the mandolin back." Not that anybody in their house could play it, but they just didn't want the loaner to be forgotten about, which is fine. Um, the guitar, my cousin had, my cousin played left-handed. I play right-handed, but my great aunt and cousin decided that as a gift they would give me his guitar because he wasn't playing it at all. And it was this big Gretsch F hole solid, you know, Yeah, big hollow body, no pickup, no electronics, just
Oh, wow.
right. But it was left-handed,
Mm.
and so I strung it upside down because I couldn't, right? And so then the intonation went out the window. But this is at 15 or 16. I didn't know what intonation was, right? That's what I learned on. The action was probably 3 feet of action, but I didn't care because I was playing string bass, so I had a strong left hand. And eventually that guitar got sold and whatever, and I still have Gretches, by the way. But that was how that happened. So I think my mom was probably happy that I was still playing music, but not that happy that it wasn't on the piano.
Yeah, yeah. And there was a lot of backlash about that. I'm a product of the 60s. I started playing guitar in
Yeah,
1966 after bugging my dad for a couple of years. So I
right.
completely get that. So, at what point did playing music out, in other words, outside of the house, at what point did that did come in and how did that look?
So as I said, I was in choir in Temple as a soloist in Temple, and this is as a high school student, right? And then there was a youth group, and we would go and play music at the Jewish old age homes and things like that, RIFTY, religious youth of Temple Israel. And so that's kind of where it started. But I eventually, so I was also at the same time I was going to Emerson College in Boston, and I was studying radio TV broadcasting, and
Interesting. Okay,
and
that's
that
what I
was
majored in at UNC Chapel Hill. So,
okay, and that was much more interesting than playing guitar was, and so the guitar sort of took a big backseat. I don't think I popped open the case for years. I still had that big Gretsch. It was just sitting in the closet, and when I moved from apartment to apartment to apartment, it would come with me, and I'd look at it, and every once in a while, I would take it out and strum it and put it back because it was then really difficult to play because the action was huge. And then, and so I sort of went off to another world, right? And then I went into the corporate world, and I was doing all sorts of other stuff there. So my wife and I are sailors. We got involved with the local sailing club here in Dallas. And one of the things that was happening was we'd go away and for the weekend and go racing. It was Hobie Cat racing. We go
okay.
racing, and there would be like a Saturday night campfire. And it's like, okay, I can play some songs for that. So I got rid of the Gretsch, got an old Martin, and that's sort of my reintroduction into playing music more so than in the living room.
Cool. I want to pause for a second because I want to
Yeah.
talk about getting out of Emerson College. Did you remain in broadcasting? Kind of how did your corporate path take you between Boston and Dallas?
So, yeah, so a good question. I didn't stay in broadcasting very long. I was a production assistant in New England for a couple of radio stations and for TV station, and then I got involved in the hi-fi business when it was.
Hmm.
As a matter of fact, my heart just sank. So the hi-fi business in the late '60s and early '70s was a very technical business. Um, and so the company I was working for was also supplying audio equipment to the local TV stations. They were a Sennheiser organization, things like that. They're out of business. They've gone long ago. And as a matter of fact, I was just reading one of my things. The Bose Corporation just bought
Hmm.
Macintosh Audio.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not surprised. And of course, the Bose is in Framingham and Marantz and
Yeah,
all. I think about all of these companies because I became a bit of a hi-fi nut at that time as
yeah,
well. I had no money to do it, but it was
yeah.
a great thing, and people really records and I think this probably would resonate with both of us. Records were, I won't say a spiritual or religious experience, but they were close in the 70s because if your favorite artist gets a new record out, you can't wait to get home and listen
Oh
to it.
yeah,
And if you've got even decent speakers, it becomes all encompassing. It's certainly more
absolutely.
encompassing, than a cell phone or a computer because our world was really two ears at the time, right, Sam?
Yeah, so it is true. So I was in that business. I did some recording, I did some field engineering work, I did some audio engineering work, And so I sort of, and that's sort of how I ended up doing what I'm doing. I mean, I can't. It sounds pretty happenstance, but I suppose if you sit down and figure it out, it will all make sense, maybe. Um, but so you know, I, I've lost the question that you asked me. So
Now, just
anyways, I
kind of
spent.
how did corporate and all that get you to Dallas, or was corporate what got
Oh,
you
okay,
there? And
yeah, yeah,
how?
yeah.
Yeah,
So actually, um, I was actually I moved to Michigan and lived in the Royal Oak area, and met a gal there, and we got married. And I was basically a systems engineer. So I was router certified and operating system certified and database certified and all these technical stuff. Um,
this
and
was with
and
Big Blue, was it?
no,
I was going to say
no,
this
but
sounds very familiar because I actually went to junior high school, part of senior high in Farmington. It's now Farmington Hills. I know Royal Oak very, very well. We are back there visiting with friends a couple of months ago, so I know that whole area. And
so yeah, yeah. So the two things about that. First of all, so I connected up with actually a Canadian company. They won a contract in Dallas that required an engineer on site in Dallas, and they said move to Dallas, right? So that's how that all happened. That's how I ended up with Dallas. But back in Michigan, you may actually know this person. I think he just passed. A guy named Ron Coden. Did
I
you ever
don't,
know Ron Coden?
it doesn't sound familiar, but we moved in April of 1971, so that was almost into my sophomore year of high school. So I don't, the name doesn't sound familiar.
So
Russ
he
Gibb, yes. Ron Coden, no.
so he did a kids TV program in Detroit, and he did a little character, but he was also a folk singer performer.
Cool.
And so I bumped into him, or bumped into him, found him at a steak and ale because that's when they had a bar area with live entertainment.
Yeah.
So there was a steak and ale. We call it steak and jail, steak and ale, and um, and he was doing he was doing all the folk songs and a couple of show tunes and a lot of comedy intermixed with his show. And he was really good. Plus, he was on TV, and I can't remember the name of the show. Is Hot Fudge? I think the name was Hot Fudge. The show was Hot Fudge. It was a Channel 7 WNAC
Hmm.
production. It was local production. Um, and it turns out, um, so I became a groupie and followed him around and whatever. And then when I started to do my own solo show, I started to think about who can I template? What can I do that, because there were two things about his show that that stuck in my mind. First of all, he was doing fun songs. He was doing Charlie on the MTA. He was doing You Left Me, It's a Fine Time to Leave Me, Lucille. He was doing all sorts of stuff. Um, and he had a bass player and a lead guitar player, and he was a center guy. He played a little guitar, but basically it was a trio, and it was fun and it was entertaining. He would do the green grass grew all around, right on the tree. The rains, blah 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 blah. But when you do it in a bar full of drunks, it is hilarious, right? So he had that show down, and he was one of the guys that I said, okay, one, I can steal some of his jokes, which I've done, and two, he becomes a great template for the type of thing I'd like to do. And the Kingston Trio were the same way, and the Limelighters were the same way. They all came out of the mold where you would play music for people and you would talk to people either about the music or about the jokes or about what was going on. It wasn't just blowing music at them one tune after another. So it was always interactive, and it was always fun and upbeat, and even the serious songs, the ballads had a way to get them interesting and get. So that's how I template my show.
This is really interesting. I don't mean to interrupt here, but
No,
you're
that's
the
okay.
first person that I profiled on this podcast that said, you know what, find somebody that's doing what you're doing and kind of mentor yourself after him. I've had this conversation with David Payton, who discussed a fellow named Matthew Cotillo, who was in New York, who was like the number one guy in gig masters for years and years, and actually wrote a book about that.
Hmm.
I've certainly learned from stuff from him. I've stolen stuff from David. I've stolen stuff from my buddy John Byron Haney. All of these guys, and I
Yep.
think that's a great way to do that. In fact, in the very last podcast, podcast 41, I said, go out and watch people, go out and learn from them. What are they doing? What can you use, and what's available to you?
There was something. There was something that I think it was Peter from Peter Paul. Was it Peter or Paul from Peter Paul and Mary? I think it was Peter. He was being interviewed, and he was talking about the days in Greenwich Village when they would play. You know, Peter Paul and Mary spent 6 months. Their manager wouldn't let them out, learning their set, right? It just kind of so different than today, right? But they spent 6 months doing it, and it showed. But he was talking about the life in the Greenwich area, Greenwich Village, where all the folk, you know, the clubs were, and his comment was they used to finish their set and finish their gig, and they would run down to another club to see another performer because that performer was doing some of the same songs, but they were doing it differently. And they wanted to see how the other people were doing their songs, but doing them differently. And you don't get that anymore. People don't do that anymore. And it was all part of that sharing. It wasn't, oh, this is my song, nobody else can do it. It was, okay, you do this, you do this. So we talked about Charlie on the MTA. You know, Wreck of the Old 97 is the exact same song.
Mhm.
So I actually jammed the two together. And I do Wreck of the 97, and I do Charlie on the MTA, and I do them as one medley, back to back. And you know, and that's the kind of thing that you just don't hear anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. So let me ask a couple of questions
Right.
about that.
Go ahead.
First of all, when did you, so you started doing solo gigs, what, when you got to Dallas, and that early on took the form of just playing at these camp things?
Yeah. Just it was having gigs. It was just pulling out a guitar and playing, you know, at the campfire, right?
Yeah.
Campfire stuff, right? That's
Yeah.
all it was.
Yeah.
The story about how I got started in this. So I have played a few bars, but I generally don't do bar gigs. I just don't do them. One, I'm too old, and two, I just it's not what I do. The company that I have, Lone Star Sound, is exclusively providing entertainment to retirement homes, independent, assisted living, memory care, all that, and have a bunch of performers in the company, and that's all we do. And they're 1 hour shows. So you go in, do your show, get the hell out, right? It's real simple. I I was actually at a song circle, right? A jam song circle, right? And people maybe don't know the difference. There is actually a difference between a jam and a song circle, but we don't have to get into that. But I was at a song circle, and it's at a very famous place here in Dallas called Sons of Herman Hall.
Yep.
And they have it, and they have the Thursday night electric campfire jam, and it's been going for 30 years. And people come in and go out, and the people change, but the jam doesn't, right? So I'm sitting in the bar at the jam, and the bartender yells, "Is there a Sam Baker here? You got a phone call." So I said yes, and on the phone is a booking agent who says, "Can you play a gig on Saturday? We'll pay you." And I said, yeah. Tell me more about it. Well, it's at the blah 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 blah, and she gives me the whole thing, and I said, okay. So I grabbed my Martin guitar and my little Fender amp and went to the gig to find out that it was at a rehab place, nursing rehab. It was in a big dining area. So it's all solid floor, solid ceiling, solid walls, big echo chamber, right? And the ice machine is right there in the corner. So every 15 minutes, there's the ice. If you've ever seen one of those big industrial ice machines they have at bars, right? Every 15 minutes, another bunch of ice fell into the hopper. That was my introduction to it. And so I learned two things. I learned not everybody likes 50s folk music, so I better figure something else out. I was playing some Jimmy Buffett stuff and things like that because I was doing campfire, right? And so live in Dallas, right? So the genres don't mix. It needs to be something else. And the second thing is you need a microphone and you need some amplification because you never know when there's going to be an ice machine. But the other thing I learned was this is probably the most appreciative audience I've ever been at.
Absolutely.
And so that was, that was probably in '09 or 10, something around there. I was working for the company which I now own, but you find out that, okay, so you get paid a little bit and that's nice and, keeps gas in the car and stuff. But what really you learn is that in some of these facilities, the rehab facilities mostly, memory care facilities mostly, sometimes in the assisted living, not much in independent living, this is the only entertainment these people have other than bingo and television.
Yes.
And so you get a different sense of accomplishment and a different sense of contribution because all of a sudden these people are coming up to you after your 1 hour and they say, oh, we really like your music. One of the best compliments I can get is, I haven't heard that song in years. Thank you for playing that song, whatever it is. So that's how I've done it. And then in 2017, I bought the company from the owner and have been operating ever since.
Fantastic. We're about to run out of time on this one, so we're going to stop this one and we'll pick up in just a moment. I'm Riley Wilson, and you've been listening to Sam Baker on the Band of One podcast. If you've got ideas for future podcasts, you get in touch with us. You can do that through our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/Band One podcast, or email me directly off my webpage, which is guitarmadesimpler.com. We'll see you next time. I'm Riley Wilson for the Band of One podcast. So long.